thank you for joining us. My name's Adam Skinner. I'll introduce myself properly later on. But today we're going to be talking to you about something that's hugely close to, I think, the heart of what the APM does, and certainly what my company B2 Consulting does. We're going to be talking a lot about program planning in both a waterfall and in an agile world. What's different, what's the same, and what are some of the principles that underpin this particular activity. I'm joined by a genuine master of this craft, a gentleman called Andy Willis, who'll be introducing himself a little bit later. So listen, without further ado, let me crack on very quickly, introduce my company. I work for a company called B2 Consulting. Hopefully a few of you have come across us. We're essentially a digital transformation house. We've been formed for about 7-8 years now, and really did get ourselves set up to act as a genuine competitor to the Big Four, to provide support to many organisations in the retail and the public and the financial sector. We do that through offering and delivering on our 3 P2 promises. That's to improve, control and deliver on organisations' transformation ambitions. We do that through the 12 services that fall under the improve, control and deliver promises. Today, of course, we're going to be talking about programme planning, something that's absolutely at the heart of what we consider our control activities. So how do you help organisations understand the journey that they need to go through to take themselves from state A to the wonderful state B that everyone's promised? So this is what we're going to be touching on today. As mentioned, my name's Adam Skinner. I'm Director of Consulting here at P2 Consulting, and I'm also the APM's co-chair of the Portfolio Management SIG. And so some of you may have heard me talking about the Introduction to Portfolio Management webinar and one of our thought leadership pieces, which is how you make the hard decisions. So actually, if you're interested in those, you can still get the webinars for those, and you can also find that on the SIG homepage on the APM site. So do pop in there and have a look. And let me just hand you over very quickly to my colleague Andy Willis. Andy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Adam. As you can see, been around within changing environments for a number of years, predominantly in the delivery, PMO, planning space. I've led a number of assignments and initiatives on some fairly big planning activities. Ones you can see there certainly around EU exit, ONS and Lloyds Banking, amongst others, many others as well. So I have got quite a bit of experience in the planning space. More recently started to do some planning in the Agile space as well. So again, I've had a few years of experience in there to couple with the kind of more broader waterfall experience I've had as well. And on the side, I run our consulting academy for our graduates within P2.
Great stuff. Thanks, Andy, for that. So onwards. Planning. Why on earth do we planning? I mean, planning is such a fundamental part of what we do. There's that wonderful quote at the top there from Benjamin Franklin. If you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. And planning forms such a huge part of so many different delivery methodologies. The main thing I really wanted to draw out on this side is planning, or a plan is not simply a document that shows you stuff that's going to happen for us. A plan is construction of a whole range of different artifacts, from resource models, from risk models, and so on and so forth. All these things that come together to give you and your team and your wider stakeholders a view of one particular potential future. Usually the most likely one, the most favourable one, but let's not forget it is just one potential version of the future that you're trying to create. Of course, Prince 2 for them, it's about the what, the when, the how, the by whom. But even in the Agile world, of course, it's really important to have a sense of what is supposed to happen going forward. The sentiments there, we need to know what's happening in the future. The artifacts will change. Our model for planning in a traditionally waterfall environment, and Andy's going to do a deep dive into this in a few moments. I think the real thing I wanted to draw out from this slide is actually you can go through a reasonably standard approach in most waterfall programs to establish what is a really good quality plan. So there's a real discipline there, and actually taking yourself through that, I think, rather than simply sticking down the first 5 milestones that come to mind. So this is the model we like to follow, and we've used it successfully right across our client base. So Andy is going to drop into this shortly. Of course, Agile has a slightly different view on the world. Agile is something that I'm hugely keen on, particularly safe. We do quite a lot of scale Agile work. And interestingly, I'm sure you've heard people say that you don't do planning in Agile. Well, you have my permission to throw anyone who says that out of the room, because planning is fundamentally important in Agile. In fact, for those of you who know scaled Agile, probably the premier ceremony, certainly the biggest ceremony, will be the planning increments, when you literally have everyone in the room for a 2-day session. All you do is plan. The artifacts might be different, but the primary activity is understanding a version of the future that works for everyone and getting alignment to that. So planning is just absolutely fundamental whenever you are trying to deliver some form of change. So at that point, let me hand over to Andy, who's going to talk in a bit more detail through what we believe really matters in the world of waterfall planning. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Adam. So I suspect of the 169 people we've got on the call at the moment, the vast majority will have probably or be familiar with or come from a background that is waterfall in its nature. And I think up until probably 5 to 10 years ago, it was broadly the only game in town. And in many respects, all projects should, in theory, start out in the same way. We should understand what our scope is. We should understand what our objectives are, our deliverables are, understand what the outcomes are. But I guess for many of us, the first thing that we're asked if we kind of land onto a project, especially one that's got some high-level stakeholder oversight on it, is where's the plan? And immediately there's an expectation that there's a schedule there. And quite often the terms are used interchangeably. And that's not the case. The plan, as Adam mentioned, is a combination of things, and we'll touch on those. But if nothing else, things like the products and the work breakdown structure, the resources, the capabilities, dependencies, and so on, all of these aspects go into the creation of a plan, which ultimately ends up with the creation and management of a schedule. So if we turn to the next slide and what we're doing in terms of products. So again, we're all familiar, hopefully, with Prince 2. Products are an essential component, essential part of a Prince 2 delivery. But what's a product? Well, a product essentially is, it could be, an example of a product could be a new IT system. It could be a management product, so for example, an end stage report. In actually creating the products themselves, what we need to do is we need to kind of break it down into smaller chunks so that we understand exactly what it is that we're building and the products that we're building. So we should be creating things like a product breakdown structure. We should create a product checklist. In many cases, a product flow diagram. How do these things actually all link together? All of this is part of the product-based planning. And it's all essential that we do this so we know exactly what it is that we're expecting to deliver at the end of this. If we don't have this view, how do we know that we've been successful? How do we know that ultimately the schedule of activity that we create is going to deliver what we're expecting it to create? In many cases, and we'll talk about the planners or the responsibility of planners later, but quite often a project manager or a senior team within a project will expect the planner that will actually kind of pull that activity together. Certainly the planner should be helping to pull that activity together. It's not ultimately the responsibility of the planner to do that. It will be a combination of folks within a project that should actually help to build what those products are and get them signed off as well. So as we go through the products, we need to then start breaking these down. If we go to the next slide, how do we actually deliver the products themselves? Well, as it says there, the mighty work breakdown structure. And I think we've all got a level of familiarity with this. And it just takes those products that we've identified and breaks them up into smaller, more manageable chunks of activity. Otherwise, we've just got one humongous lump of things in a plan, potentially not interrelated sufficiently. But by actually breaking it up into a formal work breakdown structure, allocating and identifying the chunks of work which you can allocate to individuals, that you can allocate to teams, and also then, ideally, you would look to understand what's the capacity that we require, what's the capability that we require. Identifying all of that gives you a fighting chance then of sequencing it right in terms of then creating your schedule as you kind of move forward into the next phase of delivery. So, as it says here, once the WBS has been created, we do the work package estimate of the required effort. Again, the estimating of the work effort is important and needs to be done not only in conjunction with the planner, but also with things like the project managers, the team managers, the individuals themselves. It's an understanding of the whole of the project and all the activities within the project, because if we don't have that, we're not going to be able to kind of start scheduling, and then we won't be able to start managing our deliveries, or we find it very difficult to manage our deliveries. So as you can see here, taking our product list, taking our work breakdown structure, it's at that point that allows us to then start sequencing and then start creating what we have from a schedule perspective. And clearly, I suspect most of us have some familiarity with some form of project management tools. You know, I've used a screenshot there of Microsoft Project, but again, it could be Primavera, it could be others. It could be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. It's not the ideal thing to work within, but again, if it's a fairly simple plan, we can use tools such as that. Clearly, as we go through the schedule, one of the things that's important to do as we build this schedule out to a lower level of detail, as we say there, identifying the key milestones, you know, the level zeros, the level ones, the level twos, all the way through a lower level of detail, establishing the dependencies so that, you know, we understand if we need something from somebody else, when are we going to get it? Managing the delivery of that dependency, managing the risks and issues that may be associated with that as well. And clearly identifying what that critical path looks like. Again, we've all been on projects, I suspect, whereby our critical paths have either not been clearly understood or haven't been sufficiently developed, such that if we do start to see challenges in part of that, if we don't know that they are critical path items, quite often that will then come and bite us on the backside, and we'll start to see overall slippage within the project. So it's important that all of these things come together and we're able to sequence all of this activity, critical path, dependency, constraints, capacity, and so on, into an effective schedule that we can then start to use. As we move forward then, we'll have got our schedule, and clearly one of the things that we'll have, and what's quite likely is when you build your first schedule, you'll need to kind of you'll look at the plan and go, Christ, that's taking us far too long. You know, we expected it by September, it's telling us it's December. Well, the first thing we need to do is to kind of look to that and optimize the schedule that we've got. Quite often we can adjust sequencing, we can adjust dependencies, we can look at the constraints that we've got. Clearly we need to maintain the integrity of the critical path, but actually by just adjusting a few key levers within a plan and a schedule, sometimes we can pull back days or weeks off the ultimately end delivery date of a plan without materially impacting what it is that we're doing. Again, consider the scope that we've got. Is it that we can actually deliver some of the scope initially in a first phase? Is it we can deliver some of the scope in a second phase? Consider running activities in parallel. And again, I'm sure we've all been on projects where we've kind of got to the testing phase and suddenly realise that our time available for testing is quite tight, and we've run various testing phases in parallel. Now, it's not ideal, but actually it can be done. It just needs a lot of coordination, a lot of sequencing. Those are the types of things. Clearly, we look to try and avoid that, certainly at the start of the project, but certainly as we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of the project, and if we do find ourselves constrained by time, actually it's one of the things that we can look at. Again, look at previous projects. Look at the risk profiles that you had of those projects. Quite often, we don't learn from lessons from previous projects, and we reinvent the same set of problems that happened previously. Go back, have a look. We'll touch on Agile in a while, but kind of regular lessons learned, retrospectives as we call it in Agile now, of what we've done. Again, really, really useful. Apply that thinking to the planning and to the scheduling that you're doing, and adjust. You know, a lot of the time, activities will have a higher risk profile because, for example, you could have reliance on one SME, and if that SME is split multiple ways, actually it becomes very difficult then to almost kind of guarantee that they'll be able to deliver to time. Actually re-looking at the work and resequencing some of the work might be an activity that will help us to optimise the plan that we've got and get something that's more fit for purpose. So as we move on, ownership of the plan, really, really important. And again, I've been on, I'm sure others have been on as well, projects whereby plan ownership is grey at least, or sitting in that grey area. The project manager will go, it's not me, it's the planner. The planner will go, it's not me, it's the work stream leads. The work stream leads will go, I'm only responsible for my bit. Ultimately, it should be the project manager who's accountable to the project board for delivery of the plan. Quite often, you'll find individuals won't necessarily take that responsibility on, but clearly, ideally, that should be the case. The planner is responsible for pulling all of this together, but actually doesn't deliver the plan. The project manager and the team, the work stream leads and so on, will be responsible for delivery of their part of the plan, or overall, the overall delivery of the outcomes and the objectives of the plan. So it's really important that you get that up front. And quite often you'll find, within a plan, you've got multiple ownerships at different levels. You've got the team level, you've got a work stream lead level, and you've got a project level. Again, having a good, and we're all familiar with the term, race lead, as an example, who's responsible, who's accountable, who will do what and when, really, really important. It's one of those things that if you don't get it right, and you don't have that clear accountability and responsibility, then your project in many cases just won't succeed, or at least it will have a number of challenges associated with it. So we've got the plan, we've got a schedule. What are we doing about a baseline? Again, we've all heard the term baseline, and quite often people don't like to use the term baseline. Baseline is a commitment. It's a commitment by the team. And again, I'm sure we've all been familiar with or worked on projects whereby baselines seem to be fluid in their nature. They shouldn't be, certainly not in a waterfall environment. We should have a baseline up front for a project. It's inevitable that we will go through a level of change. I mean, I don't think I've been on any project whereby we haven't gone through some form of change. However, baselining the project up front and getting a clear indication of what the dates are and the commitments are being made by folks within a project to delivery is absolutely essential. And if we don't do that, again, what we'll find is it's too easy for things to drift. And in drifting, we'll see it, the project starts to go south, you incur more cost, scope starts to get challenged, and quite often the timeline will go out the window. So it's important that we do the baselining activity, we get the commitment from the plan or the parts of the plan owners that are delivering into the plan, and they're held to account for that as well. If there isn't an accountability, and if we aren't kind of tracking that, then again, it's very difficult to keep that plan on target. So we've got a baseline schedule of some description, we've got a plan. What then? So it's in many ways, a plan is a living document. It's inevitable that things will change, especially if you've got things like resource changes. Your resource plan might change. You may find that some of the timing changes because of dependencies and so on and so forth. So it is a living set of documents, a living set of content. But it's important that what we have in place around that allows us to control that as well. We've got a plan, we've got a schedule, reporting on that, very important. Now, whether it's kind of a weekly thing or whether it's a 2-weekly thing, I've certainly been on projects that it's both. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you go beyond 2 weeks in terms of reporting on plans. Certainly not kind of to monthly or beyond that, unless, of course, you've actually got a very high-level plan with perhaps some level 0 milestones, which are by their very nature things that don't tend to move around too much. But certainly at the lower level, reporting on the plans, at a minimum 1 or 2 weeks, and ideally a weekly report as well, so that we can at least keep an eye on what's going on and make sure we have a correct oversight for any challenges as and when they're identified. And of course, identifying challenges early through management of our risks is really important. And if we don't manage those risks and the dependencies to the plan, again, what we'll find is that things will start to drift, and we will get ourselves into a situation where the only course of action we have is to either ask for more money, is to change the scope, or to send the plan right and increase the timelines, none of which are particularly palatable. So we've got the plan, we've got a schedule, we've got some oversight, some governance, and some reporting and control in place. That essentially sets ourselves up. What does the planner do? And we kind of mentioned the planner at the start of this. The planner is an important part, and we may find, and again, I've been on projects whereby the planner role is almost a combination of a PM and a planner, or it's part of the PMO's responsibility, and you've got some planning capability in there. Quite often, certainly on the larger projects, the more complex projects or programs, the need for a individual or even a team of individuals that look after the plans and the schedules is paramount. Because there is so much that can change, actually keeping a quality eye on everything that's being delivered, any changes that are happening, as I said, be that kind of risk that are coming through. One of the key things that I certainly do, and again, I'm sure folks have done the same thing themselves, as a kind of a lead planner, pulling together things like the status reports that are coming through, looking at the risks that are coming through, looking at the planning data that's coming through, pulling all of that together, triangulating it, and then coming up with snippets of insight. And this is where I think, the planner working in conjunction with a PMO lead and potentially a program manager or program director, there's a key relationship there to make sure that we have a level of assurance that is undertaken at that lower data level perspective. And it's important that it needs to be treated as an assurance function. It's not the planner telling tales on delivery leads, whatever. It's actually making sure that our commitments to our stakeholders, be that business or otherwise, actually are being maintained. And working closely with the delivery leads, working closely with the PMO, program director, or so on, in providing that level of assurance based upon the data that's there, triangulating it, as I said, and just coming up with small snippets of information. And that could be as simple as a conversation for half an hour once a week. That could be as formal as a status report or something of that nature. It really depends on the local requirements of the project or program. But certainly, that level of diplomacy, because you're going to have to work closely with all members of the team, the kind of steely backbone of actually moving things forward and getting them done, but also the technical wizardry to draw out the content from wherever you kind of store planning data or risk data, wherever it is, pulling all of that together into something that's distillable and usable by senior folks within the relevant project organisation is really important, which is why the planner role is such an important role within the project. I think that draws me to an end of the waterfall part, Adam.
We've probably got a few minutes for questions here. Here's a good one. Do you have any rule of thumbs around the levelling of milestones? You talked about level 0, 1, 2, and 3. What's your general rule around what sits at what level?
Yeah, I do. So level zeros, would normally tend to be at kind of the balls type level. They would be almost maintained at a portfolio level, but the viewpoint of those is likely to be, let's say, for example, a exco, a steering group of some description. Level ones may well be at your program level, and obviously every level 0 that you've got should have one or more level 1s driving it, so that we understand if level 1s start to drift out, what's the impact on our level 0 plans. Level 2s and 3s, again, depending on the size of the project or the program, you could find that it could be a set of project boards underneath that control that, or the project manager. It really depends on the makeup of the environment you've got. But, kind of level 0s, ESCOs, level ones, program reporting, portfolio reporting, and then level twos and threes, probably within the project, probably at kind of work stream level. That's my basic rule of thumb for leveling of milestones. It also depends, it's not only a governance and oversight, because that's visibility, but it depends on the materiality of the milestone as well. Quite clearly, if you've got something that's big, for example, a go live, you'd clearly want to make that probably a level 0. If, for example, you've just got a set of releases which are interesting to senior folks within the project organisation, again, you might not want to necessarily make that level 0s, but there might be kind of that level 1 type level. Again, it depends on the needs and wants of the organisation itself, but also the governance structure that you overlay this with.
I think that's a really good answer. I also sort of use the rule of thumb, the reporting timeline. Actually, if it's a weekly report, you kind of clearly want something that sits within that report to tell you about progress. If it's 2 weekly or 4 weekly, that for me drives a lot of the sort of level 2 or level 3 size. I think, sorry, probably time for one more question. Do you believe there's a minimum size below which a project task does not require a plan? And if you do believe that, if not, how do you ensure a plan can be created and managed in a way that's very efficient and effective for such projects?
Yeah, I don't think there's any project that shouldn't have a plan of some description. If you don't have a plan, how do you know what it is that you're delivering and when you're expecting to deliver it? So even if it was a very simple plan on a page with half a dozen, maybe a dozen key milestones, but something that says, by the end of next week, I expect to do this. In 3 weeks' time, I'll expect to do that, and so on and so forth. It doesn't necessarily need to be hugely detailed, but at least have that forward-looking view of what it is that you're doing and when you're expecting to do it by. If you don't have that, how do you know that you're kind of on track? How do you know that you're delivering what you said you would deliver and when you said you'd deliver it? If there isn't a commitment to delivery, have you actually got a well thought out and well structured project? So I actually argue that any size of project or change should have some form of plan. It just may vary in terms of detail and content.
Great stuff. So Andy, agile planning, presumably that's identical.
if only. Agile it's an interesting one, and if I kind of cast my mind back probably 5 years or so when I started to get more involved with Agile, I was very much a Luddite. It's just a bunch of folks who don't want to commit to anything, and they're not going to tell us when they're going to deliver, and I need my milestones. And it was only as I started to get more involved and realised that actually Agile is, for me personally, I find that Agile is again, personal opinion, a better way of working. It's not necessarily perfect, but I do find that actually bringing together Agile behaviours and ways of working, I think you almost kind of get a better chance of success. It's not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination, but I do find that Agile delivery tends to have a better chance of success and delivering the things that we committed to deliver than perhaps Waterfall had. It's just a personal opinion. Waterfall projects can be very, very successful, but I think in the ways that we're kind of moving forward, and I love the team structure and the team approach of Agile, and we'll talk about how the planning gets done within that, but actually that collective responsibility for planning as opposed to one individual pulling it all together in the plan or the PMO, I think it's a shared commitment. So, and I've touched on some of this, and Adam, I think your comments, it's exactly the same as Waterfall. No, it isn't. Yes, we still plan. Absolutely, we still plan. However, it is different. In many senses, if we kind of start with a Waterfall project, we kind of almost want all of the detail and to know exactly what we're going to do for the next 6 to 9 months up front. And if we don't have that, then we don't have a plan. In the Agile world, we're slightly more pragmatic. We'll plan to a sensible planning horizon, whatever that looks like. And that could be, the next 3 months. That could be the next 2 time boxes or sprints. So we'll do some high-level planning up front. And interestingly, again, quite often when we're starting to mobilise cross-functional teams to work within an agile environment, there won't be a team in place at that point. You know, we'll have done our, if I use the DSTM terminology, we'll have done our feasibility, done our foundations. The project manager's there, he kind of knows roughly what he's doing. The project manager will create a high-level plan. And that high-level plan may be as simple as there's an end date of when we kind of want to deliver something. I've got the next planning increment, which is 3 months, and within that I've planned out the first 2 time boxes. After that, the team itself will then kind of pick that up, work with it, shape what those time boxes look like, pull the right scope from the backlog, look for the resources, etc., etc. And the one thing, of course, with Agile is the ability to change things on a fairly regular basis. I mean, Agile embraces change, whereas Waterfall, albeit it supports change, generally tends not to embrace change. It tends to be a bit of a dirty word in many respects. But actually, Agile will constantly look to kind of do the right thing at the right time. And if that means changing some of the scope, changing what the client wants because the client needs to change, then that's fine. It will embrace all of that activity. So therefore, there isn't a great deal of point in kind of planning out for months in advance. Actually, what we tend to do is planning out over a much shorter period of time. And that's what the diagram here is telling us that. Effectively, you've got things like your time box planning and reviews. You've got your planning iterations, which will come in between the major sections of iterations, kind of roughly every quarter or 10 to 12 weeks, something like that. But it's also a time at that point when you get into those planning iterations just to reset, just to make sure, are we still delivering the right things? Are we still got the right dependencies on target for us? And what is it that we're delivering and our commitments to deliver it? So it's really important that we kind of get that regular, almost reset in a way. It's certainly a review of what it is that we've done and what we need to do as well. So where does the planner start? Where's our planner in this world? I think as we move on to slide 19, what I've tried to do here, so actually in our Agile world, in our solution development team, we don't have a planner. And I'm going to caveat that. There may well be planners outside of the solution development team that have some form of interface into these solution development teams. And we'll touch on that very briefly, but certainly if it's kind of a high-level program or a portfolio or something. But actually within the SDT itself, planning is a collective responsibility. It may be coordinated, and it probably will be coordinated by the team leader or the scrum master, but the team will be part of that, and the team will shape what it is that they're doing. They'll pull necessary scope from the product backlog. They'll decide what they're going to be doing during the time boxes. They'll look at the resourcing that's required, etc., etc. So it's a much more collaborative approach to planning, I think, than perhaps we would have been used to in the waterfall world, whereby it was kind of more centrally controlled. This is absolutely a responsibility of the team to deliver that plan. So what does our Agile planning approach look like? Again, as we move on to the next slide, and we've touched on some of this, but at its simplest, there's kind of 4 major areas of planning here. We talked about the high-level plan, and that could be start, end, program planning increments, time box planning, planning for the next program increment, planning increment, whatever you will call it. So there are different terminologies for broadly the same thing. And that will be, as I said, roughly every 10 to 12 weeks. That could be once a quarter. It could be slightly longer. It depends on the organisation itself. But ideally, one of those planning or program increments every 10 to 12 weeks. We've got time box planning, which is obviously the individual sprints within an increment, and then we've got deployment planning. And deployment planning is quite an interesting one because quite often an engine is created within the engineering teams that are kind of just constantly delivering features and as part of the scope that they've agreed to. This gets dropped into, and in this particular case, we talked here about continual delivery and release on demand. Quite interesting, often the bottleneck is actually the business itself, and it's their ability to receive that change and actually implement it into the business. And certainly I've worked in environments whereby the engineering and the platform teams could deliver much more, but they were restricted by the ability of the business to go, actually, as part of all of these changes, we need to train people, we need to implement new processes, we need to change our low-level procedures, etc., etc. And all of that takes time. And therefore, actually, what you tend to get into is a release of value every, in my particular case, I was working recently, every 3 months. And there would be a big release. It would be timed according to periods within the business. It would have the proper training associated with it. All of the processes would be written in advance, etc., etc. All of that change in functionality would be delivered as part of a release schedule. It wouldn't necessarily be a DevOps approach where it was releasing every 2 weeks or so. But as you can see, there is a significant amount of planning that will go into that. And I know from my experience on that, you broadly almost spend the entire period planning for that release because you wanted to make sure that it was right. And it's carefully working with the business to make sure that they've got all of their people lined up to receive that, really important. So, deployment planning, key part of this as well. So we go on to the next slide, the kind of summary of the kind of key planning areas. And we've touched on some of these previously. High-level plans, time box plans, the planning or program increment, depending on your flavour of terminology, and deployment and release planning. And again, I've spoken, roughly about these things. There's absolutely, each individual will also plan their own sets of activities to a certain extent. They'll certainly want to know what it is they're expecting to do over the course of the next, over a sprint, to be honest. But again, it's what we're not getting into here, and I'll touch on it in a little bit, is we're not necessarily tracking milestones at this level. What we do is we track the value that's being delivered. And, that could be the user stories that are being delivered. That could be the number of points, the velocity of the teams, whatever it might be, whatever your flavour of choice for measurement, it tends to be that type of planning and that measurement as opposed to the more waterfall type approach where we track milestones at whatever level that may be. So if we move on to the next slide, again, what I've tried to do here is there is a bit of a happy medium. I mean, don't get me wrong, milestones are important. There's still a requirement within the Agile world to track some limited number of milestones. And that could be as simple as there's key dependencies, that could be external events, that could be the delivery of a system elsewhere that we need something, which again could be a dependency of some description. I think again, in environments where I've worked with previously, what we've tried to do is blend the two. So we're not necessarily holding the solution delivery teams and I want to know, for example, have you started that sprint and have you finished that sprint? That is probably the one milestone that I really don't care about. And the reason being is, if you've got your structure set out right, you always know that you're going to start a sprint in time and you're always going to finish a sprint in time. And, again, if you get into the DSDM method and framework itself or any kind of similar Agile framework, we know that we don't extend sprints. Sprints could be a week or 2 weeks or a month, whatever it is, but they don't get extended. They shouldn't get extended. What you do is you vary the scope that's within that. So actually, rather than tracking the milestones, why don't we just track the scope? So, and you can do that in a number of ways. You can, as I said, you can do that through your user stories. Have they been delivered? Have they been signed off, agreed by the business, etc., etc.? Have they been handed over to development? You can do it through tracking points. If the organisation is mature enough to do some form of point estimation around user stories, and we know that every sprint, our solution development team of 10 people is going to deliver 80 points as an example. We track that. If we know that we're kind of veering off course and we're only delivering 60, somewhere along the line we haven't delivered some scope, and we can track. And those are the things that we should be tracking because we then know what value hasn't been delivered. So it's very much a different mindset and a different approach and a different ways of working. Milestones retain a level of importance. they're not the be-all and end-all within an agile world, and neither should they be, to be honest, because of the way that we're actually looking to deliver our agile projects. So that, I think, wraps it up from me from an agile planning perspective. Adam, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about kind of roadmap planning.
Well, we've actually had two really interesting questions, which are very agile focused. So I thought we might try and tackle those two now before we jump, if that's okay. One of them is pretty much the fundamental question we get all the time. It's a really important one. It's basically for large infrastructure projects, for example, smart motorways. Can agile bring any benefits compared to traditional waterfall methods, which is, it's basically what it all comes down to when you're talking agile. What's your take on that, Andy?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's something I've wrestled with on a number of occasions, and I'm kind of just arguing with myself as to whether can agile have a place in kind of large construction or engineering type projects. I think it can. I think there's a balance between the two. I think the reality is you'd be hard pushed to start building, for example, an aircraft carrier if you didn't have a big chunk of the design done, if you didn't know how long it was going to be and the propulsion system that you've got and how big the hull is, etc., etc. So I think there's inevitably a balance of the two. You're quite likely that you could probably you start off and almost have a kind of a waterfall framework around it, but there will be aspects of that where you deliver it in a more agile way. That said, again, I think where you've got those kind of fixed timelines and an expectation from the PM that a carrier is going to be delivered in 6 years, to go fully agile and have the team vary the scope of what that carrier can and can't do, I think is probably a step too far. That said, the ability to kind of construct small teams sitting within an overall project or program and deliver certain component parts of that in an agile fashion is probably entirely acceptable. I'm sure there are those that have worked, and unfortunately I've never worked on kind of really big construction type projects. I'm sure there are those that will go, no, it needs to be absolutely waterfall, and I would entirely respect that decision, to be honest. But it feels like our preconceived ideas of what projects should be and shouldn't be in terms of the method they follow shouldn't stop us from at least trying to incorporate some of the benefits of agile into them.
Yeah, I mean, I've come from a bit of a background in kind of large infrastructure stuff. I mean, I think my answer would be actually, I do think kind of the waterfall structure lends itself to those. But where agile can be incredibly helpful is actually the mindset that underpins it, the kind of mindset that's trying to decentralize decision making, so pushing decision making as close to the person making the decisions as possible, the kind of communal planning, the communal ownership and responsibility, and to be honest, even the most infrastructure projects these days will have some form of digital or IT element, and digital just lends itself to an agile methodology, an agile mindset, because of the kind of complexity and interconnectedness of that code construction. So I think high level, you're in a waterfall world, but there's some really powerful principles in the agile world you want to be just pulling across, in my opinion. And there's always a small team build activity you can do when it comes to the digital or the policy aspect of that. What I think would be my answer on that one. But I'm sure this debate is one that's going to rage. Andy, just one more question. Somebody made a really interesting point that actually in the waterfall world, planning should still also be a kind of communal activity. Do you want to just expand a little bit more on what you meant?
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with that. Clearly what you have is what certainly some of the projects and programs I've worked on is that the planning team, and that could be one or more people, that could be a central function. And in many respects, they'll reach out and they'll work with a work stream lead, they'll work with a project manager to define what that plan and what that schedule should look like. I guess the key difference is in the agile world, when we kind of talk about the collaboration effort, we've got the whole team, that whole solution development team involved in the planning. What tends to happen, what I've seen, is that you've got a planner or a PMO working with a project manager or with a work stream lead. It doesn't necessarily always include other people from that team. Quite often there'll be an interface from the project managers to the workstream leads, or the workstream leads down to their teams. Now, if you looked at it holistically, one could argue that you've got lots of people involved in the planning, which then come back to the centre to get joined together. In many respects, the agile side of it is much more collaborative because the team do it all at the same time. That, I think, is the difference.
Okay, lovely. All right, well, thank you for that, Andy. Okay, so look, we've done some real deep dives into plans and schedule activity. I just wanted to spend a few minutes touching on something that I find really fascinating. That's road mapping and the concept of road mapping. Talking about that Agile Waterfall, I always think that my favourite definition of road mapping is actually this one from SAFe, a road map is a schedule of events and milestones that communicates plans, solutions, deliverables over a planning horizon. And actually, I think the really important word in this sentence is not the schedule, it's not the event, it's not the milestones, it's not the planning horizon. It's actually the word communicate, because in my head, the plan is a coordination tool, it's an alignment tool, it's about getting everybody together and getting them very clear about what's happening. The roadmap is something different. It's a communication tool, and it's essentially a tool that's used to form a link between the organization's strategy and the program, and as such, it's very, very dependent on that strategy. It's very dependent on how people engage with that strategy. So the roadmap is actually trying to tell a story in my mind. It's trying to tell a story to people who aren't intimately involved in the project and the program. It's trying to tell them about what's going to happen to them, what benefits they're going to see, and why they should actually care about this thing. And as such, I think it needs to be far more than just a series of milestones. As I say, it absolutely needs to tell a story. But what I often like to do when I'm running sort of road mapping workshops is actually look at some of the rules of how to tell a good story as a sort of foundation for how to build an excellent roadmap. I usually use 6 key rules here. The first really important thing about sort of storytelling or writing is actually you've got to understand that writing is very much about creating a plot rather than just a raw story. Foster defined a story as the chronological sequence of events, and the plot is the causal sequence of events. Chronological would be the king died and the queen died. Causal is the king died and then the queen died of grief. There's a relationship going on there. And I think it's really important when building a roadmap to realize this, you're trying to tell something that connects relationships between the major milestones and the outcomes and the organization. And for me, that's absolutely a golden rule of road mapping. An engaging plot trumps a linear timeline every time. I think it's much easier if you start with the ending, you start with the place you're trying to get to, much like a sort of detective novel. You need to know what the kind of thing at the end is to be able to work backwards from. This third part's quite important. Identify the main characters and the transformations they will go through. In a plot, the plot is very much about the individuals, the heroes and the villains, and what's happening to them, and that's how we relate to it. Similarly, when you're road mapping, you have to work out what are the major characters in that road map. Is it stakeholder groups? Is it organizational entities? And how do they relate to each other? What's that golden thread through them that gets you to that end point? As a word of caution, if you approach road mapping from a purely planning perspective, you'll almost certainly look at the projects and the work streams of those characters. And as a rule of thumb, this usually makes it a very disjointed narrative from sort of project to outcome. You may be much better off thinking about who from the program who's going to benefit from that and treating those groups as characters when you're road mapping. Make it relatable. There's going to be stakeholders who need to engage with that roadmap. Try and make sure that whatever roadmap you're creating relates to them and their position. If you've created the characters correctly, you shouldn't really have a problem with that. But actually, it's really important to ask yourself, when the key stakeholders look at this, are they going to see themselves in this roadmap and see the impact on them at the end? Avoid excessive exposition, really important, this one. I think there's a wonderful quote about Dr. Johnson. He once wrote to a friend, I apologize for the length of this letter. I didn't have time to make it shorter. Making something shorter and concise is always harder than putting in detail. And if we come from a project management or a planning side, actually the tendency is to try and put all the stuff on there, more stuff on there to show how kind of clever and how connected it all is. Actually, if you're coming fresh at this from a stakeholder perspective, particularly if you aren't coming from a project perspective, you need something that's simple and clear and flowing. Less on the roadmap is more. And finally, this is probably the second most important rule after the first one, get the stakeholders to proofread it. Again, the real challenge of creating a roadmap is you will be creating it from your perspective because you're the person creating it. But actually, you aren't the most important person in terms of reading it, in terms of engaging with it. So you absolutely must make sure that the stakeholders who are going to use that roadmap have a chance to look at it, to say it, to give you advice on how to improve it. I absolutely guarantee it will be made considerably better by them looking at it and engaging with it. So those are my kind of top 6 tips to trying to make sure your roadmap ties in nicely to the stakeholders who need to see it and feels more like a storytelling tool than a plan. It's hugely important for it to deliver on what it needs to do, as opposed to what the plan and the schedule need to do. And I love this final point. Actually, in so many ways, creating the roadmap is actually the point. Going through the act of working with people to shape that story helps that story embed in them, if you're engaging the stakeholders. So in so many ways, the roadmap is wonderful. The process of creating that roadmap is equally powerful as a way of getting the message out around what you're trying to do. Well, look, we're very close to the end now, and I'd like to thank everybody for their time and their attention. Just before we go, let me share mine and Andy's top 3 tips for really strong planning in whatever environment you're in. There's great stuff you can take from both approaches. We'd really recommend getting familiar with both approaches and actually not trying to force one or the other. Understand the strengths and weaknesses of both, and you'll find a really happy medium on pretty much any assignment or any deliverable, any planning activity you're involved in. Work with the team. We talked a lot about the fact that it's really dangerous if you're just a solo planner sitting there creating stuff. You need to work with that wider team to help build out the plan, not just in creating a more powerful plan, but in getting that commitment. And as I say, embrace the best of both Waterfall and Agile. We really love the regular retros concept from the Agile world, and that really to help you improve what you're doing in the Waterfall world. Meanwhile, you can never get away from having some really powerful milestones to help you understand the journey you need to go on. So I think we're pretty close to being out of time. This is us. Please do get in touch. Adam at P2 Consulting or Andrew at Willis at P2 Consulting, or also on LinkedIn. We clearly love to chat about this stuff. If we could do a slight plug very quickly, we run our own webinars at P2 under p2consulting.com webinars right across our services. Next Thursday, we're going to be looking at continuous testing, release on demand. And if you do any work in the kind of IT or the digital space, you'll know how critical it is to understand the testing and to try and improve the automated testing of your organization. So we'll be doing a bit of a automated testing 101 next Thursday. And then 2 weeks after that, we'll be looking at the future of project management, and that's going to be me talking a little bit about what I think are the major trends that we're seeing at the moment in project management and where that's going to take us in the future, with some top tips on the sort of thing you might want to do around your career and the like to make sure you're future-proofed given the state and the pace of change at the moment. I think that's all we've got time for. So that's very many thanks from me.
Yeah, thank you for your time this afternoon. Hopefully it's proved interesting and possibly insightful. If anybody does have any questions, and I know when I've done some of these previously, folks have reached out to me afterwards, by all means, pop me an email, connect on LinkedIn, no issues with that at all, and enjoy planning.
Absolutely. Thanks very much indeed, and have a wonderful weekend.